Fractions, decimals, and percents are all interchangeable. This is because they all represent a part of a whole. We can rewrite fractions as decimals and percents, which means that we can also rewrite decimals as fractions or percents, and we can write percents as fractions or decimals. So let's look at how we do this. To convert from a fraction to a decimal, we need to divide the numerator by the denominator. We know that a fraction bar always means to divide. So all we have to do is divide, in this case, 3 by 8. So if I write 3 as my divisor and 8 as my dividend, you'll notice that 8 would never go into 3. So what I'll need to do is add a decimal behind 3, which I'll bring up into my quotient, and then I'm going to add a 0 behind my decimal. I can do this because 3.0 is the same as 3, so I'm not changing the value of this at all. Now when I look at this, I know that I can divide 30 by 8. So if I divide 30 by 8, I know that 8 will go into 30 3 times. 3 times 8 is 24, and then I subtract 30 minus 24, which gives me 6. Well, I don't want to have a remainder, so what I'm going to do is add a 0 and bring it down. Again, this is not changing the value of this 3. Now I'm going to divide 60 by 8. I know that 8 will go into 60 7 times, and 7 times 8 gives me 56. So I'm going to subtract 56 from 60, which will leave me with 4. Again, I don't want a remainder, so I will once again add another 0, which I can bring down. And now I'm going to divide 40 by 8, and this time 8 will go into 40 evenly, and it's going to go in 5 times. 5 times 8 is 40, so when I subtract 40 minus 40, I am left with 0. 3/8 represented as a decimal is 0.375. Now let's look at how to convert that same fraction to a percent. There are a few different options for this. For some numbers, it's very easy to change our fraction so that it would be over 100. If I have a fraction, for instance, like 3/10, I can change this to a percent by changing this so that the denominator is 100. Well, I can do this easily because I know that 10 times 10 will give me 100, which means that 3 times 10 would give me 30. So 3/10 would represent 30%. But in other fractions like 3/8, that's not necessarily as easy because 8 does not go evenly into 100. Instead, what I can do is change the fraction to a decimal, which we did previously. We found that that was 0.375. And once we know the decimal value of our fraction, we can multiply our decimal by 100. Multiplying by 100 is the same as moving the decimal 2 places to the right. So I will multiply by 100, which means I'm moving my decimal 2 places to the right, and this becomes 37.5%. So 3/8 is the same as 0.375, and that is the same as 37.5%. This is like saying if you got 3 questions right out of 8 questions on a test, you would have received 0.375 of your questions correct, or a score of 37.5%. Now to convert a decimal to a percent, which we've just done, we know that we are going to multiply by 100, which is the same as moving the decimal 2 places to the right. So I can move this decimal 2 places to the right, and 0.538 is going to be the same as 53.8%. To convert a decimal back into a fraction form, we would read this fraction as 5/38 thousandths. I know that this is 538 thousandths because the 5 is in the tenths place, the 3 is in the hundredths place, and my last digit, 8, is in the thousandths place. So I would read this as 538 thousandths, and I can write that as a fraction. So I would write 538 thousandths as 538 over 1,000. Now, when I do that, I can simplify. So the last step I always need to do is simplify to make sure that I have this in simplest form. Well, I see that these are both even numbers, so I know that I can divide both of these by 2. When I divide 538 by 2, I get 269. And when I divide 1,000 by 2, I get 500. Well, when I'm looking at this, I don't see any numbers or any factors that these two numbers would have in common. So 0.538 is the same as 269 over 500. Now let's change a percent to a fraction. A percent always represents a number out of 100. So if I want to change a percent to a fraction, my first step is always going to be to write my percent as a fraction over 100. Then all I need to do is simplify. When I look at 45 and 100, I know that both of these can be divided by 5. So 45 divided by 5 is 9, and 100 divided by 5 is 20. Now looking at 9 and 20, I don't see any factors that those two numbers have in common, so that means that 45% is the same as 9/20. Now let's convert a percent to a decimal. We've done converting decimals to a percent, but when we convert a percent to a decimal, it's like we're working backwards. So to convert from a percent to a decimal, we would divide by 100. Dividing by 100 is the same as moving a decimal 2 places to the left. Well, when I look at 45, it looks like it doesn't have a decimal, but every whole number has an invisible decimal behind the number. So there's really a decimal here, and we can take this decimal and move it 2 places to the left, and now 45% is the same as 0.45.